During the first decade of the 20th century, Western views of the nature of reality changed radically. This change was driven by new findings in psychology, in technology, and in physics. In 1900, Sigmund Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams, which is a huge work that explored the power and the influence of the subconscious mind on all of us. He argued convincingly that we are driven by psychic forces that we do not well understand in the human mind. In 1903, the Wright brothers flew the first self-propelled aircraft, and Marie and Pierre Curie isolated the radioactive material radium for the first time. In 1905, Albert Einstein changed our perception of time, space, and substance with his theory of relativity. Matter could no longer be considered solid. Rather, it was a form of energy. The art of the 20th century, then, comes from a series of revolutions in thinking and in seeing. Its characteristics are those of the century itself. There's rapid change, there's great diversity, there's a sense of individualism and exploration that happens, and these are always accompanied by abundant discoveries. Newness and change became artistic ideals. Each generation and each group of artists believed it was their duty to go further than the artists who came before them. At the beginning of the 20th century, the avant-garde was firmly in place. In 1903, a group of young artists formed the Salon d'Automne, or the Autumn Salon in Paris, as a progressive alternative to the French Academy. And Matisse emerged as the leader of a wild new trend in painting called Fauvism. The explosion of new styles at the beginning of this century grew from Impressionist and Post-Impressionist innovations. In their search for forms to express the new age, European artists often looked to ancient and non-Western cultures for inspiration and for renewal. And in doing so, they completed the breakaway from Renaissance techniques, which had dominated Western artistic thought for 500 years. And we saw that beginning to happen in Impressionist work and in Post-Impressionist work. So just looking quickly at Matisse's Harmony in Red, we see that there is a whole new world dawning in art. The rich maroon of that tablecloth shows a deep blue vine pattern that also claws its way up the walls. The colors of the fruit are bold and they're flat. The window with its bright golden edge looks out to a radically simplified yet intensely colored scene. So there's an ambiguity of space here that's both happening because of the use of color, the characteristics of the shapes, the way the designs cross over from one space into another, spatial ambiguity. Matisse saw a large collection of Gauguin's Tahitian works in 1905, and in his painting, he extended the older artist's expressive color choices. He also led a group of painters who experimented with vigorous brushwork and large, flat areas of bright color. Their first group exhibition shocked the public. A critic that saw that show derisively called the group Les Fauves, otherwise the wild beasts. So Fauvism is a term that means wild beasts. Its characteristics are expressive thoughtfulness to the paintings. The subjects are reduced to outlines, and color is liberated now from describing form and space. Every part of a painting by Matisse is expressive, and we see that reflected in his quote. He says of his own work, "What I am after above all is expression." So the color, the subject, the composition itself serves that main purpose. He frequently reduced his subjects to just a few outlines rather than filling in all of the details. They're very simplified. And he did this to better preserve the original impulse of feeling that drove the painting. More detail in an artwork would merely overburden the viewer and distract attention from the immediate burst of emotion. Right? Matisse's painting, The Joy of Life, is a more radical Fauvist work that shows the artist's degree of enthusiasm. Pure hues vibrate across the surface. Lines largely freed from any kind of descriptive role align with simplified shapes to provide a lively rhythm to the composition. There's a lot of movement, a lot of curvilinear lines that flow across the design. It's an intentionally direct, almost childlike quality to the forms, and that all to get taken together serves to heighten the sense of a joyfulness in the content of this painting. Matisse had actually befriended another Fauve painter, the painter André Derain, while they were still in art school together. So André Derain's London Bridge exhibits all of that brilliant, expressive color, but it's also balanced by a sense of composition and traditional perspective. We can see in the bottom left corner the influence of Seurat by the use of the pointillist dots. They're just a little bit larger and a little bit more expanded and spread out, right? Fauvism didn't last very long. It only lasted from 1905 to 1907, but it's still one of the most influential developments of the early 20th century. And in broad terms, the work led to an increasing use of color as an independently expressive element in the works that would come after that. Fauvism was part of a larger movement that was spreading across Europe called Expressionism. Expressionism with a small e can be used as a general term for any art that emphasizes inner feelings over objective description. It can be traced to the emotional emphasis of the work by the Romantics that we've looked at, and also the expressive rhythms of Baroque works by artists like Delacroix. So it has its roots in history, but it also diverges from those in really significant ways. With a capital E, Expressionism specifically refers to German Expressionism in the early 20th century, where the expressive ideal really landed and found its greatest influence. Like the Fauves, the Expressionists were influenced by Post-Impressionists Gauguin and Van Gogh, as well as the work of Edvard Munch, who was at that time living in Berlin. So German Expressionism is characterized by vivid, often angular simplifications of its subjects, its very dramatic use of color contrasts. The German Expressionists felt compelled to use the power of Expressionism to address the human condition, often exploring themes such as natural life, sorrow, passion, spirituality, and mysticism. And as their art developed, it absorbed formal influences from the medieval German art and some non-Western art from Africa and Oceania as well. One important German expressionist group was Die Brücke, or the Bridge. It was a group formed the same year as the Fauve exhibition in Paris. These groups appealed to artists to revolt against academic painting and establish a new, vigorous aesthetic that would form a bridge between the German past and to the modern experience. So no more French academic painting. We want something that looks to the German historic cultural past, but also creates a bridge, a sense of meaningfulness and relationship to modern experience. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner was an architecture student who turned painter. He was one of the founders of the bridge. Kirchner's painting, the Street Berlin, expresses a raw emotion that's kind of similar to Munch. His street scene is a cold place of business, and there's very little interaction between the people. About isolation in a lot of ways, even though there are several people in what seems like a crowded street, none of them are looking at each other, except for the two women. Only the two women in the foreground interact. Their knowing glances, their somewhat sensual feminine gestures, and their fancy fur coats and hats are clues to the viewer that they might be prostitutes. Intense color and expressive brushwork shows a link with Fauvism here. The space is distorted, and this shows the influence of Picasso. It also provides a claustrophobic experience of the city street itself. So we've pointed out a few ways in which Kirchner's painting incorporates influences such as Picasso, Van Gogh, and Matisse, Cubism, as well as African sculpture. We can see this especially in the way the faces are represented, as well as some German Gothic qualities. The Blue Rider group was a second important group that are related to Expressionism. The Blue Rider group was led by Wassily Kandinsky, who lived in Munich between 1908 and 1914. In contrast to other German expressionists, Kandinsky hoped to lead viewers towards a spiritual rejuvenation through introspection. So self-examination, looking inward, much more of a spiritual impulse rather than the revolution of the bridge group that we talked about a moment ago. In Blue Mountain on the left side of your screen, he created what he called a choir of colors, influenced by the vivid, freely expressive color of the Fauves. Kandinsky's painting evolved steadily away from straightforward representation. In Blue Mountain, the subject matter is secondary to the powerful effect of the visual elements released from merely descriptive roles. So line and texture and color are not just descriptive, they perform a symbolic and an emotional function. He's clearly influenced by the vivid expressive color of the Fauves. He uses colors that are heightened and very saturated to peak intensity. The horsemen riding across seem more dreamlike than they do real. But by 1910, Kandinsky overturned one of the most important rules of Western art. He made the shift to totally non-representational imagery in order to concentrate on the expressive potential of pure form, freeing it from the need to depict or to describe anything. Kandinsky was a person of mystical inclinations. He hoped to create art in response to what he called an inner necessity on the part of the artist, or the emotional stirrings of the soul, rather than in response to something that he saw in the world. He said that art should transcend physical reality and speak directly to the emotions of viewers without the intervening distraction of clearly identifiable subject matter. He sought a language of visual form that is comparable to the sound language that is experienced when we hear music. The rhythms, the melodies, and the harmonies of music, they please us or they displease us because of the way they are arranged and the way that that affects us. To exploit this relationship between painting and music, Kandinsky often gave his paintings musical titles, such as Composition 4 from 1911, which we're looking at here. In Composition 4, we see colors and shapes that only vaguely correspond to things in the world. Rather, the artist painted out of inner necessity to make visible his personal mood at the time. Just as a composer uses harmony and melody, Kandinsky uses color and form, as he put it, to set the soul to vibrating. Kandinsky said that the content of his paintings was what the spectator lives or feels while under the effect of form and color combinations of the picture. He was an important innovator in the history of art, and his revolutionary non-representational works played a key role in the development of later styles. While living in Paris, the Spanish artist Pablo Picasso shared ideas and influences with French artist Georges Braque. Together, they pursued investigations that led to Cubism, another principal innovation in painting before World War I. Generally speaking, Cubist painters emphasized composition over personal expression. Cubism heavily influenced the basic visual structure of many of the notable paintings and sculptures of the century. His breakthrough painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, or The Young Ladies of Avignon, shows a radical departure from traditional composition. Picasso created a new vocabulary of form influenced by Cézanne's faceted reconstructions of nature and by the inventive abstraction and power he admired in African sculpture, such as the Coda reliquary figure and the mask from Ivory Coast that we see here on screen to the right. While the meanings and the uses and the significance of African sculpture held little interest for him, their form revitalized his art. With this painting, Picasso shattered the measured regularity of Renaissance perspective, doing away with vanishing points, with any kind of uniform lighting that runs through the entire painting, with any academic figure drawing. He overturned some of the most important traditions of Western art. By comparing these two paintings, we can get a better understanding of the progression from post-impressionism to Cubist styles. And we can also start to understand what Braque's additions were to the Cubist vocabulary. In a series of paintings, landscape paintings made in the south of France, where Cézanne had also worked, Braque took Cézanne's faceted planar constructions a step further. Instead of the regular perspective or atmospheric perspective that was common in European painting since the Renaissance, Braque's shapes defined a rush of forms that pile up rhythmically in a shallow space and in an ambiguous space. Buildings and trees seem interlocked in a way, in a heaving array that pushes and pulls across the picture surface. When Matisse saw this painting, he declared it to be nothing but a bunch of little cubes. And in that way, the houses of Lestock provided the occasion for the name of the movement, Cubism. His somewhat dismissive attitude indicates the widely varying goals of the Cubists and the Expressionist Fauves. So we have all these groups of artists together making paintings, making sculptures at the same time, and they have very differing views about what's important in painting right now. From 1908 to 1914, Braque and Picasso were jointly responsible for inventing and developing Cubism. Braque later described their working relationship as resembling mountain climbers roping together. They worked for a time in relatively neutral tones to explore the formal structure without any emotional distractions of color. Okay, so here we see a really strong distinction with Fauvism. Neutral color, it's all about the formal qualities, it's less about emotion. So here are a couple of examples. During the phase of analytical cubism, Picasso, Braque, and others analyzed their subjects from varying angles and then painted abstract geometric references to these views. This is how we see, after all, by building up a mental image made through brief, focused glances at a subject rather than a long, centered look. So think about how often we get a sense of the entirety of something by scanning across the surface multiple times. Because mental concepts of familiar objects are based on experiences of seeing many sides, the artist aimed to show objects as the mind rather than the eye perceives them. Braque's The Portuguese from 1911 is a portrait of a man sitting at a cafe table strumming a guitar. The subject is broken down into facets and recombined with the background. So again, figure and ground collapse into a shallowed and a jagged pictorial space. Cubism was a rational, formalist counterpoint to the personal emphasis of the Fauves and other expressionists. It's very different in that way. Above all, it was the reinvention of pictorial space. The Cubists realized that the two-dimensional space of the picture plane was quite different from the three-dimensional world that we move through. Natural objects were points of departure for abstract images, demonstrating the essential equality of forms within the spaces that surround and penetrate them. So to paint something that is visible as a natural object in the real world for the Cubist was really about creating a lack of separation between form and the space that forms occupy. Cubism thus reconstructs objects based on geometric simplification. And by looking first at Cézanne's Garden, then at Braque's Houses at Lestock, and then finally at the Portuguese, we see a progression in which forms seem to build and then break apart and then spread across the surface in overlapping planes. In 1912, Picasso and Braque modified analytical cubism with color, with texture, and with patterned surfaces through the use of cutout shapes. The resulting style at this point became called synthetic cubism. So taking a look at the newspaper in the violin, fruit, and wine glass, it's a part of a real traditional still life of objects, but rather than paint the fruit, Picasso cut and pasted printed images of fruit. Such compositions, called papier collé in French, or pasted paper, became known as collage in English. Analytical cubism involved taking apart or breaking down the subject into its various aspects. Synthetic cubism was a process of building up or combining bits and pieces of different materials. Picasso would extend the Cubist revolution to sculpture when he assembled his guitar from 1914. This is assembled from pieces of sheet metal. The flat pieces in this work overlap in ways that are similar to a Cubist painting. The work began a dominant trend towards construction and sculpture. Before guitar, most sculpture was carved or modeled in clay. Since guitar, a great deal of contemporary sculpture has been constructed or assembled. At the beginning of the 20th century, the most influential sculptor was Auguste Rodin, who had brought a new expressiveness to the medium. The Romanian Constantine Brancusi started sculpting under Rodin's influence, but later his work moved toward abstraction. A sequence of Brancusi's early work shows his radical yet gradual break with the past. Sleep of 1908 appears similar to Rodin's romantic naturalism. And we see this image in the upper left of your screen here. Below that, Sleeping Muse from 1911 simplified the subject a great deal and moved away from naturalism and toward abstraction. So Brancusi's journey toward abstraction was also a journey back to pre-classical styles of carving. Ancient sculpture from the Cycladic islands of the Aegean Sea has a distinctive and highly abstracted elegance that we see also in Brancusi's work. Just as the Cubists had studied African sculpture, Brancusi spent time sketching works in the ancient Mediterranean section of the Louvre. He eventually would eliminate all surface embellishments, and we see this in Newborn 1 from 1915. It's stripped to its essentials. Brancusi says, its simplicity is not an end in art, but one arrives at simplicity in spite of oneself, in approaching the real sense of things. He achieved expressive strength by carefully abstracting and reducing forms to their essence. As a result, his sculpture invites contemplation. With Bird in Space, on the right-hand side of your screen, Brancusi used cast bronze to create an elegant and uplifting form. The implied soaring motion of the bird embodies the idea of flight rather than an actual bird. The highly reflective polish Brancusi applied to the bronze surface contributes to the form's weightless quality. Brancusi started working on this visual concept about a decade after the Wright brothers initiated the age of human flight. Brancusi said, "All my life, I have sought the essence of flight." The American public had its first extensive look at leading developments in European art during the Armory Show, which opened in New York in 1913, before traveling on to Boston and to Chicago. The Armory Show of 1913 marks a milestone in art history in America because it introduced modern art to the United States. In this show of over 1,300 works, the organizers attempted to demonstrate that modern art was not revolutionary, but rather had evolved from movements in the mid-19th century. Most of the public missed this lesson, however, in the shock of seeing Cubism and Expressionism for the first time. Although the show was controversial, it was also extremely popular, drawing over 300,000 visitors. American artists were able to see for the first time key works by Impressionists, Post-Impressionists, and Fauves, particularly Matisse, who was much maligned by critics. Also shown were paintings by Picasso and Braque and sculpture by Brancusi. As a result, Cubism and other forms of abstract art spread to the United States. As Picasso and Braque took the steps that led to Cubism, Alfred Stieglitz was turning photography into an art form. And we discussed Stieglitz quite a bit in the chapter on photography. So just to kind of draw some connections, Picasso saw Stieglitz's photograph, The Steerage. And when he did, he said, "This photographer is working in the same spirit as I am." And by that, he meant that Stieglitz had a similar eye for abstract composition. So taking a look at the photograph, we can see that Stieglitz saw the complex scene really as an array of interacting forces of light and shade and shape and direction. He was aboard a ship headed for Europe when he saw the composition of this photograph. It was a picture of shapes, and underlying that, the feeling that I had about life, is what he said about making it. He rushed to his cabin to get his camera, and he made the photograph that he considered his best. Even before the Armory Show, Stieglitz played a key role in introducing the new European painting and sculpture to Americans. He had a gallery in New York City, and he also, remember, had the publication Camera Work. So in addition to being a photographer, Stieglitz was also a promoter and was instrumental in the later influence in bringing modern art to the United States. In 1905, he opened a gallery in New York and began showing the work of the most progressive European artists, including photographers. Following the exhibition of art by European painters, Stieglitz began to show work by the first American modernists, including Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz had a nearly lifelong relationship. The works of Georgia O'Keeffe consist mainly of abstractions based on nature, and Evening Star #6 is based on her experience of seeing a planet Venus in the sky at night. Venus is left unpainted, and the dominant experience of this painting really is those swirling swaths of vibrant, highly saturated color. So O'Keeffe and Stieglitz's relationship lasted for many, many years, nearly lifelong, and it evolved from a place of admiration. So Stieglitz would invite Georgia O'Keeffe to exhibit in his galleries. It evolved from that into a deep friendship and artistic inspiration. So we can see in some of Stieglitz's photographs the influences of O'Keeffe's abstractions, and in some of O'Keeffe's paintings, particularly the ones that she made in New York City, which I believe you can see in your textbook, we can see in those paintings the influences of Stieglitz's abstractions. So working together, inspired by each other, and then ultimately they married. So they stayed in communication even though they separated in their marriage. Between 1905 and 1910, architects began to challenge traditional concepts of form and space, just as the painters had done. So we see the influence of Cubism in architecture as well. While Cubism was developing in painting, the leading American architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, was designing what he called prairie houses, in which he often omitted or minimized walls between living and dining rooms and between interior and exterior spaces. Before Wright, who began designing in the 1890s, there wasn't really a definitive style of American architecture. The pinnacle of luxury, or the sort of the height of luxury, would have been owning a European style home, European-esque. So you can think French Empire style or Italianate with columns, even Gothic revival before Wright. But to Wright, who was madly in love with America's landscape, its people, its democratic values, this reliance on Europe for aesthetic sensibility was a tragedy. Throughout his decades-long career, Wright would design more than 1,000 buildings and put American architecture on the map with his innovative ideas and his timeless aesthetic. Today, he's recognized as one of the most accomplished architects of all time. Though he created a number of famous public works like the New York City Guggenheim Museum, Wright primarily worked with private homeowners to build the homes of their dreams, and the homes of his dreams too, naturally. He's perhaps best known for pioneering the prairie-style house, such as the Roby House that we see here from 1909, which is characterized by its dramatically flat, cantilevered roofs, by neutral colors, a minimalist kind of aesthetic, and simple but striking silhouettes. Inspired by the open, flat expanse of the American prairie, Wright's designs sensationalized both the interior and the home design worlds. The Futurists translated the speed of modern life into works that captured the dynamic energy of the new century. The Italian Futurists were among the many artists who gained their initial inspiration from Cubism, but they used it to different ends. To the shifting planes and multiple vantage points of Cubism, Futurists such as Giacomo Balla and Umberto Boccioni added a sense of speed and motion and the celebration of the machine to their work. By multiplying the image of a moving object, Futurists expanded the Cubist concept of simultaneity of vision. In other words, multiple viewpoints are visible at the same time. So they expanded on that through multiplying the image of moving objects. So in 1909, the poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti proclaimed in the initial manifesto of Futurism, "The world's splendor has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A roaring motor car is more beautiful than the classical victory of Samothrace." And so here we see the complete overthrow of Renaissance ideals. We do not know exactly what type of automobile Balla was observing, but the fastest racing cars in 1913 reached speeds of 100 miles per hour, faster than both the airplane and the train of that time. Boccioni insisted that sculpture should be released from its usual confining outer surfaces in order to open up and fuse the work with the space surrounding it. Does that sound familiar from the way that we talked about some Cubist work? In his figurative sculpture, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, muscular forms seem to leap outward in flame-like bursts of energy. The work seems to depict not a walking person, but the air moving around. During this period, the human experience of motion, time, and space was transformed by the development of the automobile, the airplane, and the movies. Futurist imagery reflects this really exciting period of technological change. The French artist Marcel Duchamp, working independently of the Futurists, brought the dimension of motion to Cubism. His nude descending a staircase #2 was influenced by stroboscopic photography, in which sequential camera images show movement by freezing successive instants. And we can see this in the painting #2 from 1912. Through sequential, diagonally placed abstract references to the figure, the painting presents the movement of a body through space, seen all at once in a single rhythmic progression. Our sense of gravity intensifies the overall feeling of motion. So the movement from high to low really sort of activates our own sense of gravity, our own personal experience of that. And when this painting was displayed at the Armory Show in New York, it caused cries of dismay and was seen as an exercise in madness. The painting, once described as an explosion in a shingle factory, has remained an inspiration to artists who use rhythmic repetition to express motion. Sonia Delany-Turk expressed motion in her paintings through color contrast. Her large work, Le Bal Boulier, is an interpretation of couples moving about on the floor of one of Paris's leading nightclubs at the time. We see Cubist influences in the work, as it is composed of flat shapes that overlap in shallow space. So there's a 2D motion and movement from left to right that's really emphasized here. The added push and pull of contrasting color contributes both to a sense of depth and to a sense of motion in the composition. So again, 2D and 3D are working together. Stretching this canvas of 12 feet across proved difficult, so the artist used mattress ticking to do so. Delany-Turk was an early crusader for the integration of modern art into everyday things. Even as she painted, she made bookbindings, embroideries, textiles, and fashions that included ideas from the latest modern art movements. In 1922, she started her own clothing design studio, where she specialized in what she called simultaneous dresses. Not for many years would such ideas take hold in the mass market. So we see a couple of themes running through the last chapter of our module here, ways in which the art that is being made is rapidly changing over the course of a very short period of time, ways in which new developments in technology are turned into inspirations for ways of thinking about space and design and movement in painting. We'll see in our next module how the artwork that's being made today and the artwork in between and post World Wars was influenced by what we've just looked at. So looking forward to our last module together, everyone.